So I'm just going to have a bit of a ramble, really, about this last International Men's Day. So this is more of a podcast hosted on a video site than a video, I suppose. International Men's Day was founded in the 90s, or at least resurrected in the 90s. Intended to be a kind of celebration of men and an excuse to bring up men's issues and to raise awareness of them and to hopefully have them addressed. And pretty much ever since, but certainly in recent years, it has been instead something of a battleground. And every year the problem is largely the same. International Men's Day becomes not about the issues, but just fighting to get those issues recognized at all, addressed at all. The constant refrain is that, isn't every day Men's Day. Inconveniently, it also happens to fall on the same day as World Toilet Day, which obviously leads to some jokes. But they get boring, and they have been told so many times. And the problem remains the same. Men do have problems. Men have quite a lot of problems. But this perception, this idea, this insidious lie that we have, that men are somehow in charge of everything, that men are the dominant gender class in every single way, that women are the oppressed, prevents us even beginning to have this conversation. Now that said, this year things were a little better, I think. I didn't notice so many high-profile events, but there were lots of little things going on here and there. And the overall tenor of the hashtag on Twitter was a lot less combative and nasty than it has been in previous years. Oh, sure, it was still an absolute trash fire, but comparatively, it wasn't so bad. A hopeful sign, weird as it may seem, is the increasing interest from commercial organisations. Shops and stores, businesses and so on are looking to cash in on Men's Day, to turn it into some kind of promotion, like a reverse Valentine's Day in some ways. So there were people trying to sell suits and beard accessories, all kinds of other things in the hashtag, to the point of making it unusable for a quarter of an hour at a time at some points. But that shows an increased acceptability and a lessening in the supposed association with MRA misogynists. Not that MRAs are misogynists, but that's the perception. So that's hopeful. Well, it doesn't mean there aren't also causes for concern, and now that the day has passed, it may be time to reflect on some of that. But just quickly as a diversion, while I'm talking about reflecting, while I'm talking about thinking, a lot of what has gone on this year, particularly, seems to be a kind of subversion, a way of trying to twist what's supposed to be a day about men around. You have lots of pushes to examine it from a feminist perspective, from a woman's perspective, when this is supposed to be the one day a year where we don't do that, where people listen to men and try and understand their point of view and their problems. But instead, very much, we seem to find this push. Lots of people were trying to make it about so-called toxic masculinity, or patriarchy hurts men too, or let's take this day to reflect on how we can be better men and all the harm and damage that we do in the world. If you set about to make those kind of arguments on Women's Day, you would be hung, drawn, quartered, diced into cubes, fed to dogs, and the dog shit would then be set on fire. But somehow this is something acceptable to do to men on their day that's supposed to be addressing their issues. But like I said, it is perhaps an opportunity for some reflection on men's issues, on the men's rights movement. To be clear, I don't really consider myself to be a men's human rights activist. I consider myself to be a human rights activist and an egalitarian. I have some particular issues that cross over very strongly with Men's Day, which tends to have a fixation on trying to address men's mental health and suicide rates, which reflects upon me as someone with suicidal depression. But I don't consider myself particularly an MRA. It's just I think their arguments are pretty sound at the moment. The things that they're fighting for are pretty sound. You know, there are issues like male genital mutilation, like suicide, like depression, like men's health, like men's cancers, like the disparities in education, the sentencing gap. So many things that go unaddressed. The lack of support for male victims of intimate partner violence. Something like 40% of victims of that are men, but they get less than 1% of the support that's out there. And it's not right. But I'm a leftist, and people continually associate men's human rights, men's issues with the right, with traditionalism, with conservatism. It should be the natural territory of the left. The left's philosophy has always been about egalitarianism, about fairness, about addressing structures of inequality. But that has become this identitarian movement now, where it's no longer about addressing equality or fairness, but seemingly about addressing grudges. The left has bought in entirely and absolutely to the idea that women are an oppressed class as a whole in all situations and circumstances, and therefore that men as the oppressor cannot have problems or be oppressed in any way. And that's simply not the case, and it's to the detriment of the left. It is my left-wing beliefs that lead me to egalitarianism, that lead me to wanting to address men's issues that have gone so unaddressed for so long. And that's what takes me to this point of reflection. We need more out-and-out left-wing people talking about these men's issues, as we should. It fits our philosophy, it fits our ideology, it fits the underpinnings of the whole Labour, socialist, left-wing movement as a whole, right across the board, from centre-left all the way to the wildest extremes that you can find, and similarly in the libertarian axis. And yet, the spokesman we're forced to associate with, the people who do speak up on these issues, at least the ones with any real profile, are almost exclusively right-wing, often cranks, often traditionalists, and it's not a good look, and it's strange and weird. And I don't want really to be associated with the Conservative Party, whose members seem to be the only ones that speak up on this issue, while the left tries to blockade talking about this issue. Philip Davies, God love him for speaking out on some of these issues, and he does often have good points around this issue, this set of issues. But he is a conservative, and as such I do not agree with him on the vast and overwhelming majority of things that he says. And due to the tribalism, unfortunately, that we have in a lot of politics, most people are not going to be able to look past that, as I have, and say, okay, he's a cock, but I agree with him on this, this, and this, as much as I disagree with him on that, that, and that. They're just going to see another Tory twat mugging around. They're going to interpret anything he says or does in the worst possible way, and he's going to essentially be detrimental to what we're trying to achieve. And he's not the worst of it. Mike Buchanan, for all, again, I agree with him on some of the things that he talks about, and as much as I appreciate his efforts to organise men and boys conferences and so on, he is a crank. And he does not express himself well. He is wildly undiplomatic, and when he does appear on shows and things, which he does a lot, he does not leave a good impression on the public. For all some of us may appreciate the ponage that he dishes out. Paul Elam and A Voice for Men, who I think were necessary and great at the beginning. I think their use of satire and so on is fairly masterful, or at least would be if people understood that it was satire. But that abrasive, combative tone that was necessary to draw attention at the beginning is less and less useful and often detrimental. This image of traditionalism and conservatism needs to be shaken off, because it's really not accurate. Addressing and updating men's gender roles without making the same mistakes that perhaps feminism has in the past, but doing for men what feminism has done for women, the good parts, the liberation, the acceptance that you should be allowed to be whatever you want, that kind of thing. These are radical acts. These aren't traditionalist or conservative acts. Trying to find new forms, new acceptances, new ways of masculinity, trying to make men's choices across the board accepted without falling into the trap of condemning traditional choices as feminism has. These are all radical acts, not conservative, not traditionalist. The ideas of helping men open up and so on, this is not traditionalist, this is not conservative. That would be maintaining a stiff upper lip. But there's a balance, I think, that needs to be struck. I mean, on that issue, Stoicism has value. It has helped me survive. Distancing and intellectualism and so on, these are important, and they're better for men, I think, than other ways. Talking can be useful, can be helpful, but it takes longer for men to open up. It's harder for men to talk about their feelings and so on, just by virtue of being men. And I think some of this is just natural. Some of it's culture and so on, of course, but I think there are gender differences, and applying this one-size-fits-all approach, trying to pretend that men are somehow broken women and that making them more feminine is somehow going to help. I don't think that's true at all. We can make advances for men without making the same mistakes that we've seen feminism make. Hopefully. I guess I'm just kind of sick of having to explain over and over that a concern for men's issues doesn't make me an MRA, that MRAs aren't bad people at all. Many of them are wonderful, great, caring people. Sick of having to explain that her concern for men's issues and raising men's issues doesn't diminish women's issues, doesn't make one a misogynist. Sick of facing down all this nonsense about patriarchy and objectification and the mere fact of being male being demonized as toxic masculinity, and the constant denials of that, of having to justify one day to talk about men, to build men up, to help them out, to talk about their issues. Just one day. And it meets such resistance, and you spend the whole time trying to justify that fact and trying to make people aware of the issues rather than discussing the issues themselves or looking for solutions. And now there's this hijacking, this attempt to co-opt it into pushing the same old shit that we hear day in, day out, every day, all year long. Men are shit, men are terrible, men are trash, men are garbage, men are violent, men are rapists. In particularly this year, that whole sexual abuse thing has obviously, and with good reason, been used as a cudgel to beat men trying to raise their own problems. But men are often victims, and they're often invisible victims of this kind of abuse. I mean, how long Has there been, former child stars trying to raise the spectre of paedophilia and so on going on? Or homosexual abuse? I mean, Kevin Spacey, his alleged actions have made the headlines, but not to the extent that the alleged abuse of women has. We've got a lot to overcome, this natural and understandable tendency that society and men themselves have to want to protect and prioritize women. That's a big hurdle to overcome if you want to talk about men's problems. But we have to. Without all this dismissal, without all this co-opting, women expect you to shut up and listen to their problems and to unquestioningly believe what they tell you. But there's no reciprocity there. That's not the case when it comes to men's issues. I don't think a lot of that is healthy, but if it was two-way, if it was a two-way street, it would be much less objectionable. I don't know what the solution is. Get more left-wing people to understand, I suppose, and speak out to broaden and increase the spectrum of people talking about men's issues, trying to have them addressed without using as an excuse to undermine and attack men, to demonize masculinity. But I don't know how you do that. I'm left-wing, I speak out, and for my trouble, I get called right-wing and conservative, when nothing could be further from the truth. And yet, when it comes to talking about this stuff, and increasingly about anything, it's the conservatives who are perhaps the whipping boys of the current social zeitgeist. These are the ones who are more accepting and more willing to listen and to talk with me. I suspect that when things shift again, that won't be the case. But right now, they are more willing to talk. I don't agree with them, but see, here's the other thing. I understand why a lot of people who are otherwise centrist or liberal or principled when it comes to issues of freedom, free expression, and so on, I can understand why many of them would be shifting to the right. Because the right is willing to talk with them, to discuss their ideas, is willing to accept them despite their differences, while the left has become this impossibly tight orthodoxy, constantly checking itself for heretics. And that's not useful, it's not helpful, it doesn't help men, it doesn't help women, it doesn't help minorities, it doesn't help anyone. Identity politics has ruined everything. I know that sounds ironic when I'm trying to raise awareness about men's issues, but it's as a result of the existing identitarian politics that some kind of counterbalance is needed. But things are better this year. There was less hate, but there was hate. We didn't get to the point of actually discussing the issues. We were still trying to justify the existence of the day and to point out that there were issues, but that came a little easier this year. There were commercial interests, which was good. But I cannot shake this concern about the association with conservatism, about the association with the right wing, about that beggars can't be choosers, and many of the people who are in the public spotlight as spokesmen on these issues are not helpful to these issues. And things have really taken off in India, but there is definitely a worrisome conservative, traditionalist, reactionary edge to the men's issues movement in India. And that's concerning. It's by no means everyone at all, but it does have the feeling of a backlash. I don't know what to do. I'm going to continue to try to lead by example by speaking out from a left-wing perspective. I'm going to try and ignore the women's days, even when they say horrible things about men, and lead by example that way. The rest of the year I'll still argue with people, but they can have their day just as I want men to have their day. Unless things get horribly egregious, of course. And I'll keep trying to make the case from the left and encourage other left-wing people to speak up and speak out, and then maybe we can get some more balanced spokesmen out there to talk about these things, rather than having what the media clearly seems to consider a freak show rolled out year on year. Guess I'll see you next year.